Greeting all. Assalamu alaikum. Hope all are doing great and wish everyone here the best for 2024. My name is Huda Al-Faqani, Director of Abu Dhabi Sustainability Group at the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our first webinar for 2024, the greenhouse gas accounting for your supply chain, as part of our uh, web series for the year. And we are hosting this session today with the support of the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi and in partnership with our knowledge partners, CDP and Sustainability to Action. Uh, I would like to start by sharing, uh, some background information about Abu Dhabi Sustainability Group, as this platform is open for all members and not members. So the ADSG is a partnership initiative established by the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi to promote sustainability management by providing learning and knowledge sharing opportunities for all. Um, uh, to, for all to help foster collaboration and implementation of enhanced sustainable business practices in Abu Dhabi. ADSG, this series is one of our platforms that we organize in partnership with different organizations. The ADSG is the next slide, please. Is as I mentioned, a membership initiative. Hello. Is a membership initiative and open to new members willing to practice and champion sustainability in Abu Dhabi. I would like to start by reflecting from last year remarkable achievements. We celebrated our 15-year anniversary, 15 years of action, innovation, dialogue, and collaboration as a milestone in our journey towards a more sustainable future. And I would like to invite you to join a special moment as we play this anniversary video, capturing the sense of our journey and celebrating the milestone achieved together. This is before I hand over to you to our session speakers and partners. Dexter Galvin, Global Director of Cooperation and Supply Chain at the Carbon Disclosure, and Sandra Anani, Director STA, Sustainability to Action. I would like to end my welcome note with this achievement video. Thank you. Sorry, we have technical issues. Minutes and we will. Apologies, we have technical issues. Maybe we can hand over to our speakers, and maybe if there is time, we can share this at the end. Over to you, Sandra. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Huda. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this really important webinar. We are honored, privileged, and delighted to welcome CDP and Dexter Galvin to this session. I'm not sure if you can see the screen, but on this slide, just a quick introduction to Sustainability to Action. We are a UAE-based, Abu Dhabi-based consultancy specializing in sustainability, and we are very proud to be female-owned and operated. Just a general overview about this webinar. This webinar is going to really be run in a way that if you've got any questions, because it's obviously online, you have access to the chat box. I hope you can all see it at the top. If you click on that, it'll open a chat box on the right. You can put your questions in there. We have the ADSG event moderator, which is Joni. Hello, Joni. Joni will be capturing all the questions throughout. And what we will do is then put those questions to our esteemed speaker, Dexter. And then, of course, we will also have a Q&A at the end, if you like, on top of that, if you wanted more engagement. And we'll also have a feedback section at the end. We'd really need your feedback. I know that my colleague Mariam will also share a link to the feedback form in the chat box, so you can keep your eyes peeled on that. Just a quick overview as well of the webinar. So we're going to understand a little bit more about CDP. That's sort of roughly the agenda. So Dexter's going to take us through that a little bit. We're then going to have really interesting updates from CDP post COP28, so which is quite topical, quite quick, right off the bat from the COP28 event. So we're going to learn a bit more from CDP from their perspective. And then we're going to go into the really thick of it of greenhouse gas emissions and how that relates to your supply chain. How can you manage that, which is quite a challenging perspective for any organization. And how can CDP disclosures help you, and how can you join the journey towards net zero through hopefully better disclosure and management. They go hand in hand. You've got to measure so that you can see how you're going. But anyway, so that's just roughly how we are running this. And then really without any further ado, really, I think you're all waiting with bated breath. I'm delighted to welcome our keynote speaker today. A man who needs no introduction, but I will do it anyway, Dexter Galvin. Dexter is CDP's Chief Commercial and Partnerships Officer. He is leading CDP's mission-led work with investors, companies, and cities, as well as states and regions, to build a sustainable economy by measuring and acting on environmental impacts. So, I mean, that's quite a lot. And I think it's probably best that at this stage, I hand over to Dexter to fill in any gaps I may have missed. We are delighted and honored to have you on this webinar, Dexter. Thank you and welcome. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you so much, Sandra and Huda. It's absolutely wonderful to be here with all of the ADSG members, and a great opportunity to talk in quite a bit of detail today about the supply chain work at CDP and our view of the evolution of the supply chain space and the wider reporting space that CDP helped to create. So this is a really exciting opportunity for me to talk about our supply chain work and how Scope 3 emissions, you may have heard a lot about Scope 3 in the past, and perhaps not aware of exactly how to tackle those critical Scope 3 emissions. So I'm really excited to talk to you in detail about that today. So I just want to check quickly with Sandra that everybody can see the slides.
Thanks, Dexter. That's very important. Yes, we can see them. We don't have any issues. We are aware that some of the members, we just had a meeting before this, some people had some issues. Can I suggest that if anybody's having problems viewing these slides, please put a comment in the chat to see if we can help. But also we'd like you to know that we are recording this session and that will be shared on YouTube, as well as the slides will be circulated afterwards. So if you've missed something, you'll get it later.
Fabulous. Okay, wonderful, Sandra. And I've asked Sandra to help me with the questions as we go along. So what I'll do is I'll pause at the end of each section, and we'll get an opportunity to dig into some of the questions that you've been raising, because we're really covering quite a lot of information today, and we want to deliver that in the most digestible way possible. And often the more interactive we can be, the more effective the learning is. So I'm going to kick off with a little bit of background to CDP, but I'm not going to belabor that. Then I'm going to quickly run through COP28 and our perspective on the key outcomes from the wonderful COP that the UAE hosted, which was obviously incredibly important and incredibly impactful. So I just wanted to briefly talk about that, and then really get into the meat of today's discussion, which is Scope 3 and GHG emissions across the supply chain in particular. So it's a real great opportunity to understand Scope 3 emissions and to see how we tackle those emissions. And also a little bit about reporting and disclosure more broadly. Many of you will be aware that the work that CDP kicked off back in the early 2000s has now effectively become law in most major jurisdictions. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that as well, and then I will finish up with a bit of a summary. So very quickly about CDP, our mission is that we're hoping to see a thriving economy that works for people and planet in the longer term. And that the way we do that, the way we achieve that vision, is by working with investors, companies, cities, and governments to build a sustainable economy by measuring and acting on their environmental impact. So that is the main focus of CDP. And we're built around a pretty simple concept, actually, which is that back in the early 2000s, we asked major financial institutions to sign a letter to large listed corporations to get them to disclose what they were doing on carbon emissions and GHG. And so we actually had to say, because of the perceived threat of climate change way back then, because a lot of the major financial institutions at that time weren't willing to commit to the science of climate change, but we're willing to ask listed companies to disclose on that. We've grown massively since then. We now represent over 746 institutional signatory investors with combined assets of over $130 trillion. So when we ask a large listed company, we're asking them on behalf of the world's major banks, investors, asset managers, asset owners, sovereign wealth funds, all of whom are signatories to the CDP request. So large listed companies tend to get a big request from CDP every year to disclose data on climate change, water, and on deforestation, depending on the nature of their impact. We have also worked hard to expand the scope of our disclosure. So last year, over 23,000 companies around the world disclosed to CDP. But it's important to note that we follow the GHG protocol guidance on boundary setting, which means that when I say 23,000 companies disclosing, I'm talking about many hundreds of thousands of individual subsidiaries and divisions, because at CDP, we deduplicate to group level, which means companies report always at that group level across the full range of their responsibilities and their environmental responsibilities. The great offshoot of that investor-led work has been our supply chain work. And I'm really going to dig into the supply chain work today after taking you through some of the key outcomes from 28 from a CDP perspective. And I want you to bear in mind that this is from our perspective, a data gathering organization where we're really tracking how the world is responding to the climate emergency. So bear that in mind. We're a not-for-profit organization looking at this from a data perspective. And the wonderful thing is the global stocktake decision very clearly identifies the important and active engagement of business and financial institutions, cities and subnational authorities in achieving the Paris Agreement goals. So the wonderful thing there is they are all of our stakeholder groups at CDP. So that at the outset, we mentioned that we have work with investors, we work with big buyers, we work with cities, states, and regions. So from a CDP perspective, the stocktake acknowledging the importance of those non-state actors was really important to us. And urging the collaboration between those governments and the non-state actors and making sure that that link is so important just is music to our ears, because it's something that we've been lobbying on for a long, long time. And just clarifying how important that is really fabulous from our perspective, because governments operate obviously in the region that they have control over, but companies and supply chains span the entire global economy. So the interaction between those different stakeholders is absolutely critical. And of course, without capital, we can't achieve any of our goals. I would say one of the areas that we really wanted to focus in on is, and I potentially, the word potentially carries quite heavy weight here, but a potentially momentous agreement to transition away from fossil fuels. I don't need to belabor this point, but it got a hell of a lot of media coverage throughout. So really excited about the focus on getting rid of coal, essentially, and moving past our reliance on coal globally, and just broadly moving away from our addiction to fossil fuels and how we do that in an equitable and fair way for the planet. So exciting news, exciting addition to the text at the last minute, if you remember. So very excited to see that. A wonderful piece of work that came out of the Emirates, the UAE, was the Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture. And that recognizes the essential symbiosis of all of these topics, right? So if you just tackle GHG emissions and climate change, you're not getting to the root of the problem at all. You need to look at all of the environmental systems and look at the interdependency of those systems and make sure that we work to improve and drive improvements on those disclosure and those systems. And those of you from Abu Dhabi, of course, will be so aware of the vital contribution that your mangroves make to the air quality and the overall sustainability of Abu Dhabi. So huge opportunity for the world to really engage more and more deeply on understanding the impacts of the agricultural system and building those more resilient food systems around the world. So big focus on food, big focus on non-state actors. So I think if we can, as always, the COP process is about creating the infrastructure, the foundation for others to take meaningful action. So we need to take this achievement in the UAE and build on it. If we don't build on it, we don't use this incredible data infrastructure that we're starting to build out. So, for example, we announced our collaboration with EFRAG, who are driving mandatory disclosure on carbon emissions and environmental topics in Europe with the ESRS, CSRD, or however you want to define it. So that's mandatory disclosure in Europe. You'll also be aware that we have the SEC rulings coming in, which has been delayed, but a requirement for mandatory disclosure around the world. So without that robust ecosystem of data, we can't make the informed decisions to actually transition the world away from fossil fuels and high emitting, high impact areas. So if we don't have that robust, resilient data to understand where to channel capital to drive the transition away from fossil fuels, then we will really struggle to achieve our goals. So the great thing that comes out of this COP is that further enhancing that data infrastructure, the recognition of the importance of the non-state actors in the mix, and that clarion call to move away from fossil fuels in an equitable way. So that's our reflections on the last COP. Unfortunately, I myself wasn't there for the first time since Paris, in fact. So the first time I've not been at a COP. But if you have any questions or questions on our reflections on COP before we go into the meat of today's webinar, which is around our supply chain work. Sandra, are there any questions popping up?
Hi, Dexter. Perhaps it's not just particularly on COP28, but I just sort of wanted to share and ask a question from our side. And perhaps this question can help us dovetail into the next section. We are very proud at Sustainability to Action to be the first organization in the UAE to have achieved CDP's accredited provider status for 2023-24. So thank you so much. And I wanted to highlight that. And just on the back of that, to ask you, how is CDP supporting access for SME suppliers? And perhaps it can link the two topics.
Yeah, that's a great point. So a lot of the mandatory disclosure requirements that are coming through accept that there's different data requirements on SMEs than there should be on large listed global corporations. We at CDP have been slow to amend our questionnaires properly to support the needs of SMEs. However, in the past year, about 2 or 3 years ago, we released what was called the SME Disclosure Framework, which was very well received by the market. And it basically said what SMEs ought to disclose on these critical environmental topics. But we didn't back that up with an actual questionnaire. So from 2024, from this year, we will have a much reduced SME questionnaire that is more appropriate to the needs of the market, that helps smaller organizations get started on their disclosure journey without being completely inundated with data fields, and kind of collecting the right data for those types of organizations so they can make the right decisions, and also share the most relevant information with their stakeholders, so that it's not just reporting for reporting's sake, but that this data is actually driving action and affecting change. So I would say, Sandra, we've been a bit slow off the mark at CDP on having proper SME framework, but we have been working in this direction, and our new platform now allows us to collect that data, and it's hugely in demand. So, of course, the large corporations that are engaging their suppliers through the CDP supply chain program, they all want a disclosure from their SMEs. So to do a lot of the big banks and financial institutions around the world, which is really important because we're seeing a lot more, for example, sustainability linked lending. So if organizations aren't capable of calculating their emissions, for example, then they're going to be they're going to miss out, frankly. So I think excellent segue, Sandra, and I think I can take us into the supply chain program.
Thank you, Dexter.
Great. So just a bit of background here. I'd say many of you are familiar with the GHG protocol's breakdown of Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Now, when I joined CDP in 2008, we had Scope 1 and Scope 2 clearly defined, and Scope 3 was basically referred to as everything else. Then I joined a bunch of webinars to help create the Scope 3 standard, and we worked very hard on that. The WRI and the WBCSD, under the great Pankaj at WRI, led on creating the Scope 3 standard, which made more clearly defined categories within Scope 3. And the biggest one, the most impactful one, is typically purchased goods and services. But you'll see Scope 1 is your direct emissions from your emissions associated with your own direct activities. Scope 2 is essentially your electricity consumption, if I'm just boiling it down. And then Scope 3 is all of those indirect downstream and upstream impacts that you have. And so, on average, when companies report to CDP, we found that on average, supply chain emissions are actually 11.4 times higher than the average company's emissions. So this is a hugely impactful area. You can see that that can go right up to 95% of emissions for companies in the retail space, for example. And when we started our supply chain program, we actually started it with Walmart, who was sitting right at the top of the pyramid there, driving the disclosure down their supply chain. So really important to understand that emissions across the board, there's far more emissions in your supply chain. And when we first did this analysis back in 2010, I found that 4 times the average company's emissions were in their supply chain at that time. So we've seen a massive shift, potentially significant outsourcing of the emissions profile of large organizations into their supply chain, which is quite a trend, actually. It's critical. You cannot address your own emissions profile without understanding Scope 3. You don't have to have perfect Scope 3 data, but you must understand how relevant it is to you, where your emissions broadly are. Where are they in your purchased goods and services category? Are they actually downstream? Do you need to work with your upstream suppliers to decarbonize and reduce your downstream impact? So they are some of the big questions that are facing a lot of the world's largest companies at the moment. Not just companies, the US federal government, something that I worked on for 12 years, was a ruling from the GSA, which is essentially well, it was a White House ruling, but the GSA is essentially the procurement arm of the US federal government, and they engage all of their suppliers to disclose through CDP. So if you are supplying more than $50 million of business to the US federal government, you are expected to respond to CDP and to have a science-based target. So even the US federal government is driving this issue far beyond their own 4 walls. And so how does the supply chain program look? How did it evolve? Well, I mentioned that we started with Walmart, right there at the top of the pyramid. And so back in 2008, when I joined, we were engaging with Walmart suppliers, and then we started to engage with some of their tier 1 suppliers. So we had some of the likes of Colgate, Kao in Japan, L'Oreal, Pepsi, Coca-Cola. They were all early foundational members. And then it started to dig right down through the supply chain. So then we had more of their tier 1 suppliers joining. So it became this great cascade through the supply chain. And so we saw, for example, some of the suppliers to the big retailers engaging organizations like IFF, Firmenich, which many of you wouldn't know terribly well, but these are flavors and fragrances houses that are key components of things like L'Oreal's products, of things like Kellogg's products, key player in the global business system, but one that many people may not have heard of. And that's very important, that this trickles down through the supply chain, cascades down through the supply chain, and drives more disclosure. And what we're seeing at the moment is that many of our big member organizations, we now have, in the 2024 cycle, we're likely to have about 400 members. We had 350 in 2023, representing about 6.5 trillion of annual procurement spend. And these organizations are often mandating for their top suppliers by spend to disclose to CDP. They're often mandating for key suppliers to actually set science-based targets. So really important cascade down through the supply chain that's very much driving change across the board. So what are we seeing from the data at the moment? I think it's important to not just collect all of this information, and we had over 20,000 suppliers disclosing to us last year, but what are we actually learning from it? And I think one of the biggest issues is that everybody recognizes that the category purchase goods and services is relevant and hugely important. But look at how many are saying it's relevant but not yet calculated. So 24% of companies are saying, yeah, this is relevant. We know it's hugely important to us, but we haven't yet calculated that. So it's vitally important that companies get started on this journey quickly, because that 11.4 times the average company's emissions are actually in their supply chain. So critical that companies really take initiative and start engaging with their suppliers on these critical environmental topics. And we're focusing on emissions today, but emissions are a lead indicator for the other issues as well. If you look at water, water is essentially a supply chain issue. Deforestation, massive supply chain issue. So the same findings broadly ring through in the other environmental areas. One of the challenges that we've had is, and you can see it from this chart, a lot of organizations go, okay, well, what scope 3 category is the easiest to calculate? And so they kick off with things like business travel. So they may consolidate their business travel into a single supplier, and then they'll get a report from that supplier, and that becomes an easier thing to calculate. Whereas obviously engaging with the entire supply chain is more and more challenging. But I'm going to give you some ideas as to how you might approach that in a minute. Another critical point is that too few organizations are engaging their suppliers. So it's wonderful, as I say, we have almost 400 companies in the supply chain program, $6.5 trillion of procurement spend, engaging their suppliers to get them to disclose on this data. And critically, if you want to be a big supplier to any of those types of organizations, you need to have a handle on this stuff. So you need to be able to report on this information. And so the CDP Disclosure Framework is a great opportunity for you to not just generate data, not just respond to a questionnaire, but to use it as a framework for setting a strategy if you haven't set a comprehensive climate strategy before. And a wonderful way for you to communicate with your investors to say, okay, well, here's what I am doing, and with your customers and your future customers to say, okay, look, we disclose the CDP. We're putting all of this data out in a standardized way. If you want to see how we compare against our competitors, please have a look at our CDP disclosure. So very effective tool for engaging with your key stakeholders. But driving this down the supply chain is really important, and too few organizations are able to report on their supplier emissions and are actually engaging with their suppliers. And of course, one of the great opportunities here is to engage with the supply chain, because though we had suppliers report $1 trillion of risk from climate-related impacts last year, they reported $2 trillion climate-related opportunities. So huge opportunity for customers and their suppliers to work more closely together. I'm going to pause there, see if we have any questions come through. Sandra?
Hello, Dexter. It's enthralling, and I think everybody is so engrossed listening to you. They haven't posted any questions, but I have a question for you, since we were just discussing the stakeholder engagement piece, particularly in the supply chain. Perhaps if I can just ask you for quick tips from your experience, because you have vast experience in this. How can organizations engage their employees and stakeholders in their efforts to manage and reduce their carbon emissions in their supply chain?
Okay, so one of the interesting things, one of the first presentations I did at CDP back in 2008 was to Walmart's merchandisers, they're called, which is essentially their procurement team. And the way Walmart buyers, they own a piece of shelf, and they fill that shelf with the products that they deem appropriate that will sell. And they are hard-nosed commercial players. And I found when I was presenting to these buyers that they were really engaged on the topic of climate change. They didn't know that it was relevant to their work, but they found a calling beyond just driving price and quality, because this is the great existential question of our time, right? Our employees have children, they you know, their nieces, nephews, whatever it is, they have a connection with the next generation. They themselves have probably experienced some degree of climate impact in their own lives. And therefore, to have people empowered to drive and change and make a difference on this topic is actually incredibly engaging for staff. And I've seen that in procurement teams all around the world. Initial resistance, go away, my job is managing price and quality, and then actually very open-hearted engagement after that, particularly because it isn't just about saving the planet. It's also about building resilience in your supply chain to ensure that you have security of supply in future, to ensure that you're not going to be hit by these extreme climate events. And also, and another massively important element, is managing regulatory risk in your supply chain. So if you've done your job effectively and you've pushed your suppliers down on price, and you know they've got limited wiggle room on margin, and then they're suddenly hit with a carbon tax, it's you that's going to pay that carbon tax, right? Because they're going to pass that right up the supply chain. So that is one of the areas that I think is hugely engaging for the procurement teams, helps them really grasp this issue and get quite competitive about it. I see different categories of buyers getting very competitive with each other, which is another way of driving the change that we need to see as well. I hope that answers your question, Sandra.
Yes, it does very much so. And just to maybe help with going into target setting, I'll ask you a question that I had penciled myself, is how would you see sustainability goals becoming integrated into the broader business strategy for long-term success, particularly given net zero and scope 3?
Yeah,
which
I mean,
dovetails quite nicely into target setting.
Yeah, I look, to be honest, there is no long-term success without having meaningful sustainability goals. You've got a clear indication that consumer sentiment is changing on this topic. So consumers are willing to pay more of a premium than before. B2B, so your business customers are just expecting it as a baseline. Your investors, so for example, now that capital is starting to increase in cost again, investors are giving out things like sustainability-linked loans, so you can have cheaper cost of capital. Frankly, a longer term strategy that doesn't include thoughts around sustainability topics and environmental resilience isn't a strategy, because you'll be hit by various forms of regulation, or you'll be hit directly by climate impacts themselves. That's why we ask, and that's why investors ask, and that's why now the European Union will be asking organizations to do detailed scenario planning to understand the impacts of that. So not much of a plan if it doesn't consider the existential topic of the changes in the climate in the near term. Okay, so target setting.
Sandra,
well, we
may
have
I have
this.
a question?
Yeah.
Hi, Dexter. This is Nankumar from ENAC. Yeah,
Hi there.
I have a question. Yeah, I have a question. Like SBTi emphasizing, like if you have emissions more than 40%, then per scope 3, then you should consider those things. So the slides which you are showing, so almost I think all the sectors will fall under that. That you should have the target for all scope 1, 2, 3 emissions.
Yep. So the way I would suggest you do it is, and I have a slide on this later, but the way I would suggest you do it is use fairly crude secondary data, and there's lots of free tools out in the market to use that kind of secondary data to identify where your hotspots are in general terms. So then you know, okay, I have more than 40% of my emissions in scope 3. Therefore, I have to have a robust scope 3 target as part of my overall scope science-based target. So if you're just starting on that, I would use there's a lot of tools there that can do that kind of crude mapping with a sense of broadly speaking, using the secondary data that's available to me, I can understand where my most carbon intensive areas are. And the GHG protocol used to have a tool that helped with that, but there are a number of those. So I would, if you were to search for scope 3 materiality assessment or free scope 3 materiality assessment, you'll likely find a reasonable tool that will get you over the line for that early stage question. So I'm just going to go into target setting. I hope that answers your question. But I lost the slides. I'm just going to bear with me a moment.
While Dexter's finding the slides again, can I please remind everyone to put your questions in the chat so that we can make sure we try to answer all of them. If you put your questions in the chat, Joni and I will put them through to Dexter at the opportune moment. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. So just and wonderful question about the Science-Based Targets Initiative, because that's literally where I was going. So on SBTi, if more than 40% of your emissions are in scope 3, you really need to have a robust scope 3 target. The SBTi process of verification has gotten much more sophisticated. So there is a bit of toing and froing on the quality of the scope 3 targets, but you can have a look on the SBTi website to see the sorts of targets that have been approved and what those scope 3 reduction requirements are, because it's not as simple. I'm not saying it's simple to do scope 1 and 2, but it's not as straightforward as that. So you broadly have a look at what other players are getting over the line in terms of their scope 3 targets, and then you need to measure that and assess your performance against that year on year, which is challenging, particularly in the first year. You may not have the data from your suppliers, and maybe the first time that you've asked your suppliers for this type of information. And what we often find in year 1, year 2, is that the emissions go up quite considerably because the suppliers are literally only starting to understand how to calculate this stuff. So they can only begin to account for the full scope of their emissions. I think it's just really important to set robust targets, make sure that you can assess your target. You have near-term and longer-term trajectories. And you may also want to have a series of intensity targets that support an overall absolute emissions reduction target, which is something that we see quite a lot. I just want to go into the approaches of gathering this type of data, because I'm wary of how much time we have together. And so I mentioned in response to Nankumba's question that you can take a materiality assessment in the first step. So you need to understand what proportion of your emissions are scope 1, scope 2, and what proportion of emissions are in the different categories of scope 3. More often than not, you will find they are in purchased goods and services. In that scenario, you then need to work out how you're going to gather this data. And now you look at your supply chain and you say, I've got 60,000 suppliers. How on earth am I going to get all the data from them? Well, GHG Protocol Scope 3 standard says, let's go for 80% of spend. So the nirvana is 80% of spend. And so if 80% of spend for you is actually 200-300 suppliers, that's who you focus your effort on. And then you get all of the high quality data from those key suppliers, and then you come up with a way of engaging the longer tail in a sustainable way so that you're managing risk. What a lot of our members have done is that they will use the spend proxy, then they will use an overlay of how critical are these suppliers to me or to my business, and they might use a materiality assessment that they've done on working out who their most carbon intensive suppliers might be. And so you kind of smush all of that together, and that gets your key list for your CDP engagement. And you're not going to want to send a detailed CDP request to the longer tail of suppliers that aren't relevant to your overall footprint. You're going to want to find another way, or our SME questionnaire in 24, or something straightforward to engage those ones. Then when it comes to analyzing the data, so there's a beauty in the original Scope 3 protocol, which looks at the 3-dimensional view. So you have your life cycle, which you'll often understand as product level data, right? You'll have your life cycle data, and then you'll have your company level data. And so what you want to do is get the corporate level data, and where relevant, get that life cycle data. That will allow you, that life cycle data will allow you to make interventions that may be way down at tier 3 or 4 in the supply chain. So if you understand the full impacts of that product that you're selling, and you know, for example, oh, it's the fertilizer that I'm using way down at the growing stage, then that's where you need to target your efforts. And then overall, you need to target your efforts with, say, your top 200-300 suppliers by spend. And so then you get a wonderful hybrid approach where you say, okay, well, I've gotten disclosure from the majority of my suppliers. I have allocation from those suppliers. So they've actually said, because of your purchases from me, you are responsible for this proportion of my emissions. So here's the emissions that you're responsible for. And that's where they allocate at a company level. What
conference with Dave. It's very interesting.
Sorry, I just heard some background. So the that's the critical piece. It's how you actually use the data that once it comes back to you. So you can use the intensity metric. So you could say per unit of cloth, per inch of cloth, and use that. I have an emissions metric associated with per inch of cloth from one of my suppliers, or I have all of the emissions allocated to me by that supplier. And then you can use that to build up a picture of your Scope 3 emissions. And what you're really looking for here is the most primary data, so the most data that you can get direct from your suppliers as possible. So that's the most valuable, and you want to cover a big proportion of your spend. So I think that's, I don't want to go into all of the different approaches, but I think it's really useful to understand how you can use allocation data from your suppliers, how you can use life cycle data from your suppliers, how you can use crude market estimations to augment that information. But the real goal, the nirvana, is primary data from the suppliers. And so you have to understand where your influence and impact is. Can you drive the change in that supplier? There's no point in collecting data just for data's sake. So you need to be able to ensure that you're working with the suppliers that you can affect change with. The wonderful thing is, however, that if you work collaboratively with other similar organizations to ensure that you're collecting data in the same standardized framework, then it's likely that that supplier will already be responding to CDP, and then your request for information isn't particularly additional, and therefore they'll be more willing to give you that information. Very important to track the data and drive improvements in data quality. In your first couple of years of doing this, you will struggle with probably not great data quality from your supply base. So very important to track that progress, work with those key suppliers, start to understand whether there are collaborative opportunities that you can work together on to reduce your emissions, and start making clear requirements of those suppliers. You may want all of your top 200 suppliers by spend to have a science-based target. That may be a requirement of yours in the future. So that's something that you can push out through your supply chain once you've built up the reporting capabilities across the supply chain. So typical supplier roadmap, and then I'm going to move to wrapping up. You know, suppliers start by disclosing, they start calculating and reporting their emissions. They then use the fact that they've calculated the emissions across their whole organization to then set a reduction target. They start to understand how much renewables they're purchasing, maybe increase the amount of renewables they're purchasing. They might collaborate more closely with their customers, say, look, this is something that we could do to reduce emissions. They could set, now that they've already set their own target, they might want to go and get a target validated by science-based target, and they want to make that data available to all of their customers and their investors. So I'm going to close it out there, but just overall, remember 11.4 times the average company's emissions are actually upstream in their supply chain in that category, purchased goods and services. Scope 3 target setting, absolutely critical. So you need to do that if you're trying to set a science-based target, but anyway, you must, because it will help you understand and focus the minds across the organization that this is so important, because without your suppliers, you don't have a business. And then identifying all of the Scope 3 categories is important, but make sure that you collect primary data from your suppliers. If you use just secondary data, your suppliers don't even know that you care. They don't even know that you're doing this. And all you're doing is collecting data for data's sake. So let's move on this. This is important. It's near to existentially important for all of us, and this topic is only ever going to get more urgent, more critical as we grow. So I'd like to thank you all for your time today. Really enjoyed being with you. I always enjoy being with the ADSG group, and I'll hand back to Sandra and Huda.
Thank you, Dexter. Before we close off, we have a couple of questions for you from the audience.
Okay.
One question is, one of the attendees has asked is that they think it would be difficult for some sectors, unless it's made mandatory. They think it would be difficult for them to gather this information, to provide the embedded carbon amount for each product, unless it's made mandatory. What is your view on this?
Yeah, I think I've been engaging with regulators on this. Obviously, we pushed for mandatory disclosure at a company level, and that's been successful. I think product level will come in time, but 5 to 10 years, not now. We need to build up company level reporting capabilities first, and then develop that the kind of ability to collect that LCA. But that's starting to move. The key thing is that we don't have duplication in reporting on product level data, because that will just send everybody crazy, I think. It won't become mandatory yet, but it will be in time.
Great, thank you, Dexter. Another question very quickly is, are there any standard database or data sets for products with emission values for ease of reference and avoiding duplication and counting Scope 3 emissions that you know of?
Yes, past 2050, there's quite a lot of them. In fact, the GHG protocol Scope 3 life cycles standard, they have a section on their website which links to, and we do as well. If you go to your CDP disclosure and you go to the guidance associated with supplier module question 4, then you will find links to those databases as well.
Thank you so much. And I think the last question, in the realm of supply chain management, how can an organization set criteria to prioritize? I think you've already answered this, but we just wanted to make sure we've covered off all the questions we've received.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of magic soup. I think what I see with our members is spend as the primary proxy, a kind of materiality assessment of who the most carbon intensive suppliers might be, and then criticality of that supplier to your business.
Thank you. Thank you, Dexter. I'd like to thank you and CDP and all the team in ADSG and ADSG, of course. I'd like to thank Huda, Mariam, Joni, Muhammad, everyone who's worked to put this webinar together. And Huda, would you like to say anything to close?
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Dexter, for great insights, presentation, and information that will again help us to take this forward in the development of our flagship project with you. Thank you all, and looking forward to work together on this project in 2024. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Huda. Thank you, Sandra. Thank you to the team. Lovely to see you all. Bye-bye.